I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In the small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well.
So as we got ready for this show, I started thinking about an odd thing. And it involves the religious group called Heaven's Gate, which obviously is not a religious group we would want anybody to be involved in with whom we cared about. These are the people who took their own lives. But one of the things that they talked about prior to taking their own lives was the idea of their bodies as containers. Their idea was that when you die, you leave your container. You escape your container. And that might be the only thing about Heaven's Gate that's worth preserving, but it's an interesting idea. And it kind of informed my thinking about the show that we're doing today. This show is developed by our former senior producer, Betsy Kaplan, who's come back to do this one with us. And we're going to be talking today about sort of what do we owe the dead? What do we owe the body of a dead person? How do we think about it? How do we treat those bodies? What do we do when there's no body? All of that and possibly more. So stay with us. I think I can say that this will not be too macabre, but obviously we're going to talk about stuff that people, including me, often don't want to talk about. A little bit later, we're going to talk to Thomas Lynch, who's a poet, firefighter, undertaker, all kinds of things. He's been with us before. But right now, we're going to talk to somebody who has a very remarkable relationship with this topic and has written a very stirring book about it. Barbara Butcher, a retired New York City death investigator and the author of What the Dead Know, Learning About Life as a New York City Death Investigator. She's featured in Dick Wolf's Netflix docuseries Homicide New York. Barbara Butcher, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Colin. A pleasure to meet you.
So, that little idea from Heaven's Gate that I mentioned, I thought about it reading your book, and there's just one point, and one of your mentors, I think that's the right way to describe Dr. Hirsch, is quoted this way. Dr. Hirsch once said that a dead body is just a rental car that we once rode around in. Some are battered and worn out, others crash prematurely, still shiny and new. That's a stirring image. It's a little bit like that idea of the container, right? A dead body is something that used to contain us or that we used to ride around in, and now it's something else. And your book is in many ways, it's a lot of different things, and it's just great storytelling, but it's a little bit of a meditation on that question, right? What is this dead body? What is this dead body? What should we think about it? What should we do for it? So maybe in a general way, we'll get into specifics pretty quickly, but maybe in a general way, talk about how you think about that.
Oh, let's see. I tend to follow the Heaven's Gate or Dr. Hirsch's precept, which is that the body it's either a soft robot or a rental car or a container that we're given to carry around our personhood. I tend to believe that the soul, the so-called soul, is a packet of energy that comes from some universal source and inhabits the body at the time of, I don't know, maybe birth, who knows? But then when we die, when the machine dies, when the rental car or the container dies, that soul goes back to wherever it belongs. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. The body, however, is very destroyed, and it goes back to the earth, to the organic compounds from whence it came.
So let's talk about that destroyed body. And let's now talk in terms of some of the very specific stories that you tell. One of the things you do fairly early in the book is to contrast two bodies in a way and contrast the handling that you and your colleagues have of these two situations. One of them is somebody who dies in a rather opulent Fifth Avenue apartment, and the other is a person who dies in pretty much its opposite, who dies in a place called the White House, which is not the White House that we think of. It was what was sometimes referred to as unkindly as a flop house down in the Bowery area. I don't know, just quickly sketch out those two stories and then talk about why you juxtaposed them.
That's a good question. And, I hadn't even thought about why I juxtaposed them. However, I think it is not in and of itself related to the body. In other words, see, let me explain what the body is to me. First and foremost, it is a wealth of clues, of evidence. My job is to read the body, to interpret what it's telling me so that I can understand whether this is a homicide, suicide, accident, or natural death. And how I read that body is my profession. And what I gain from it is not only an answer, but sometimes justice for the families who've lost that person. So that's what the body is to me initially when I walk into a case, when I walk into a room. But then when that's done, now it is the remnants of a person, and it's the symbol of who that person was in that moment. So let's take the case of the wealthy lady who died surrounded by impressionist art, real, masters. And our wealthy son was there. It was an incredibly beautiful apartment. And her family treated her with respect, reverence even, and gentle care as her life left her body. And then the body itself, one imagines, would be taken to, let's say, Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home or some other appropriately fancy place for burial, interment, and a service. That's not her anymore. They're memories of who she was. That's her. Now let's take, for a second, Felix in the White House Hotel, a flop house filled with alcoholics and drug addicts and people who have hit the bottom of life. Felix, he too had a life. But what's reflected to me by his surroundings is that he lost everything through his alcoholism. And now he's sleeping in a 4x8 narrow cell with no roof, just a cot, an orange crate box for a night table, a 1970-something Reader's Digest, well-worn, well-read, and a picture of a woman. Everything I need to know about his life is contained in those few small objects and in the poor, frail body before me. Now, I can send him off, his spirit, and his friend, Richard, who was standing nearby. He too can send Felix's spirit off to wherever it's going and to have memories of him. But his body itself, well, most likely it would wind up in the Potter's Field of New York City because there's no one to claim him. So the person is one thing, the body, very much different.
Yeah, and you get the feeling also that there's the person who lived, there's the body that's left now that the person isn't living anymore. And as you're kind of suggesting, there's also some stuff, some relics, some remnants, some physical things that are left over. Now, it could be an incredibly expensive Impressionist art collection. But in the case of Felix, who's a Korean War veteran, there's a poignance to all of this. He's got this Reader's Digest article that apparently has something to do with romantic longing, with and has some connection to a love that he lost. And the fact that he's kind of down to that, but he's not letting that go, that's going to be with him up to his final seconds. To me, that's the other part of this. There's the person, there's the body, but then there's these material possessions that I think, it's like the old pharaohs who wanted to be buried with everything they ever owned. But there's certain things that seem to have a kind of power in that death scene.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The things that surround a person, the place in which they die tells us so much about not only how they died, but how they lived and who they were. And in the case of Felix, it was more evidence of who he was. In writing about him, I just hoped to let people know that everyone has a story, no matter how low in life or elevated. We're all somebody.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that you get into is sort of our attitude about bodies and a kind of fascination that we have with them. I think probably the more impersonal the relationship is, the easier the fascination is to sustain. You described one situation where you and your team went to the site where a man had jumped off a building, and the body was there. I think he'd landed in a graveyard, if I remember it correctly. And you were trying to shield the body from just, rubberneckers, from people who just wanted to look at it. And you were getting booed by this crowd of people who had gathered there. What's going on there? Why would people be booing you for doing what is pretty clearly a decent and dignified thing for this deceased person?
Oh, God, that was one of the strangest moments of my life. And it's funny because I just walked past there about 4 or 5 days ago. It was Trinity Church, downtown Manhattan. And this poor fellow had jumped, probably 23, 25 stories, landed in the graveyard. His head hit a gravestone. So, of course, the poor guy was just horribly, horribly disfigured. And the crowd that gathered, they were hanging on this iron fence trying to get a peek at him. And as I shielded him, a few of them began booing. And I thought, first, a rage came up on me. Like, how dare you turn his death into a spectacle for entertainment? And then I thought, wait a minute, there's got to be a why to this. And the why is probably that forestalls our own fear of mortality. If you treat a dead person as some kind of interesting spectacle, it takes the sting out of our own deaths. I mean, it's just a theory, but there must be something to it. Why else do people tie up traffic on the Long Island Expressway for hours so that they can stop as they pass a scene of an accident and see if there's any blood or brain matter on the road that they might get a chance to see? Why? I don't know, except that it must have something to do with the need to forestall our own fear.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it reminds me of one of the ways phobias are treated through so-called systematic desensitization. You expose the person gradually to more and more of spiders, maybe a picture of a spider at the beginning or a song about a spider, and you get closer and closer to looking at real spiders. We're all getting closer and closer to the day of our death. And we're all getting closer and closer to the day we're a dead body. And I think you're right that there's a kind of desensitization. If you look at somebody lying on asphalt after a car accident, somebody who's dead, and it's not you and it's not your mother, your father, your lover, then you can desensitize a little bit. Okay, I saw a dead body and I'm still okay.
Yeah. And there's, people are afraid of dead bodies. I've sometimes had friends say to me, how can you stand it? Isn't a dead body dangerous? Well, how on earth would it be dangerous? It can't jump up and hit you. And certainly you can't get diseases from a dead body unless you kiss it or some way, contact it intimately. And it's the living people you have to worry about. So I don't know why people transfer fear to the dead.
Well, the first story in your book is about a dangerous dead body, and it's a dead body that's been made dangerous by the person who has hanged himself, and he's done it in such a way that he's essentially booby-trapped his own body, so that the next person who interacts with it may be electrocuted, and you figure this out kind of at the last minute. You figure this out when other people are in danger of touching this body and make a hasty phone call and stop the thing. So, I mean, most dead bodies, maybe not that dangerous. That one was.
Yeah, that was a terrible booby trap. If I had not had my hand in a cast from a stupid accident, I would have grabbed the wire with which he hanged himself, and cut it down and would have been electrocuted. He wanted to take someone with him. Now, why on earth would somebody do that? Well, for the same reason that an active shooter will go out and kill 5 or 6 or 20 or 30 people and then turn around and shoot himself. The question is, why didn't you just kill yourself and be done with it? And there's some kind of anger. There's something that wants to punish us for not seeing his despair, his depression. You didn't take care of me, I'll take care of you.
Yeah, you've got a whole other chapter in the book that's about suicides. It was of special interest to me. My father had made a very serious attempt on his own life. He managed to survive it, but very, very nearly did not when I was about 14 years old. And I had the opportunity, which most people don't get, to talk to him a lot about his intentions and what went through his mind. And it made me realize that, I bet you every single person who decides to kill him or her or themselves has a slightly different set of feelings about it. It isn't just one or two different things. It's really, really complicated. And in a way, these scenes that you come upon are people who are no longer alive, effectively telling you a story about why they did what they did. As you point out, it's like 1/3 of the people leave notes. The other 2/3, it's somebody like you who comes in and says, what went on here? How can I help the people who are still alive, who knew this person? You may want to say a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, I think that one of the best parts of my job, and there were many, was hearing the story that the body had to tell. And that's not just in the terms of evidentiary or criminal justice things, clues, if you will, but the idea that someone's death has been precipitated by a series of events. And it's up to me to see if I can reconstruct that. And I think in the case of suicide, sometimes a room just reeks of despair. Everything is dull and brown and dry, and the whole room speaks to you. In other cases, like one young man, very, very nice looking, very nice apartment, he killed himself, but on his table were all these wonderfully colored cards that he had made of construction paper and glue and glitter. And they were invitations to his memorial service. I thought, wow, what the hell? This is so interesting. In that, he knew he had to end his life. We have no idea why, because I didn't see any evidence of that in his home. Was it a failed love affair, loss of prestige or business or security, or just depression? But yet there was something in him that cared enough about his life to want people to celebrate it. I thought, wow, that's really intriguing. And I searched everywhere to find out what could it possibly be. Signs of an illness, perhaps, something that he was going to die quickly or painfully. Couldn't find a damn thing. But I always think about him. I think there was some irony in it, too.
Yes.
Hard to say.
Yes. Well, I also just want to quickly say to anyone listening to this, if it's resonating with you, if you've had thoughts of this kind, there are many, many, many sources of help. But you can start with 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. That's a 24/7 lifeline. But please don't let that go unchecked or untreated. Talk to somebody, reach out to people who care about you, or call one of the many crisis lines that are available. So,
Thank you, Colin, for putting that in and for saying that. It's so important. People need to remember that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I know that because I've been suicidal myself multiple times. Thank God something kept me from doing it.
To that point, one of the things that you handle very poignantly in this book are your own struggles with alcohol and with depression. But I find myself still struggling a little bit with the chicken-egg question. Like I find myself wondering, some of that was probably priced into Barbara's life, just the way her life unfolded, who she was. But also some of it, one has to wonder how much of it is energized, if that's the right word, by encountering all these scenes of despair, tragedy, self-destruction, destruction by others, or just natural death. It's a hard landscape to live inside of. And I just wonder, I'm sure you've thought a lot about whether or not that contributed to some of the problems that you eventually had to deal with in yourself.
Sure. Right from childhood, from 12 years old. 12 years old, I was a depressive. By 14 years old, I was drinking mouthwash. So clearly there was something organic there in my DNA, something that made me depressive, made me anxious, and made me an alcoholic. So why would a person like that choose a field in which there's endless sorrow, endless depression, despair, destruction, the worst of life? I laugh at myself. Boy, Barbara, if you wanted to make it worse, you certainly found the right way to do that. And I wonder, is there a control aspect to it? By facing the things that are so awful in life. By doing something about it in some small way, did I, in effect, gain control over my own sadness and despair? I don't really know. I mean, medication certainly helped, God knows. But it was an odd choice of work. And yet I felt as if it were almost a calling. I understood the dead. I understood their lives. I could do it. I don't know. It's a strange thing.
Barbara Butcher, there's so many other things I want to talk to you about, but we have kind of run out of time. I really do recommend this remarkable book to people, What the Dead Know, Learning About Life as a New York City Death Investigator by Barbara Butcher. It's like sitting down with Barbara Butcher for a long, long conversation at a Greek diner that's open all night, which actually turns out to be a very important thing in the book. So Barbara Butcher, I'd be happy to meet you at an all-night Greek diner sometime and carry on this conversation. But thank you very much for what we've had so far.
Thank you, Colin. It would be my pleasure.
We're going to take a little break here. We're going to come back with Thomas Lynch, so stay with us.
In the land, just don't have no mercy in the land. He'll come to your house and he won't stay long. You look in the bed and somebody be gone. Just don't have no mercy in the land.
I'm singing at a funeral tomorrow for a kid a year older than me. And I've been talking to his dad. It makes me so sad when I think too much about it. I can't breathe. And I have this dream.
So, first of all, that's Phoebe Bridgers. I think the first time I heard that song, that was when I knew Phoebe Bridgers was kind of here to stay. Such a remarkable song. And speaking of remarkable, I would say for the person that I share a life with, the woman with whom I live, those occasions when we get Thomas Lynch on the show are maybe the most impressive things we ever do from her point of view. And we've had Barack Obama on this show. So just to give you a little bit of context, Thomas Lynch is the author of 6 collections of poems, 6 books of essays, and a book of stories. His most recent books are The Depositions, New and Selected Essays, and Bone Rosary, New and Selected Poems. A novel, No Prisoners, will be forthcoming. He's worked as a funeral director for over 50 years with Lynch and Sons of Milford and Brighton, Michigan. Michigan? What is MI the abbreviation for?
It's Michigan.
It's Michigan. All right. I panicked for a second there. Thomas Lynch, welcome back to our show.
Thanks very much, Colin. Glad to be here.
So I want to begin with just a little bit of syntax in your writing. A lot of times when you are writing about a body of a person, well, I'll give you an example. George Horton, you write in one of your more famous pieces, will take his leave, waked and well remembered, on a coming Saturday. So that's the body of George Horton. He's already dead. From a colder perspective, George has already taken his leave. But you write as though there's still something in it for George. There's some things that have to happen for George. And maybe you could say a little bit more about that. I think, there's this whole idea, well, funerals are for the family, for the loved ones, for the survivors. You write as though really the first person for whom a funeral is, and for whom a lot of observances are, is in fact the dead person.
Well, I suppose my sense of it is that the dead aren't right and truly dead until they're dismissed by the living. And my work as a funeral director, I think, is a way for the living to sort of close the gap between the deaths that happen and the deaths that matter, so that they can sort of get used to that notion. And one of the things a funeral accomplishes, I think, for the living in particular, is that it sort of brings the facts into compliance with reality. So we begin to behave as if people abide in the past tense after a funeral. Mm. Oh, before the funeral, they're still very much alive in our imagination and memory and our muscle memories and our hearts.
In many ways, a lot of us who live a modern life can go many, many years without encountering a dead body. And as a result of that and other things, I think we do get pretty weird about them. I'm going to share something with you. I will probably cry at some point, but I'll try to make it fast if I do. So when my father died, my son was 8 years old, and he had been very close to his father, whom he addressed my parents as Bob and Barbara, because that's how they wanted to be addressed by their grandchild. At the time of the funeral, there was a little family-only viewing of the body at the funeral home. And so Joey, who was, as they say, 8, had chosen 2 toys, a stuffed sheep and a plastic fairy, to put in the casket with his grandfather. This is the part that's going to make me cry. He'd also written a note. Dear Bob, well, I'm already toast. Dear Bob, I love you. If you read this, love, Joey. And he put that in the casket. And I think, for me anyway, there was this whole idea that, and the other thing that happened, Thomas, is that we got there and the people at the funeral home had done their best to kind of make him up, but they had put this kind of almost sort of terracotta looking makeup on him. He looked more like a clay figure of his own face than he looked like himself. And Joey kind of climbed up on a little stool and actually put his finger on my father's face and kind of poked him because it didn't look quite like Bob. And he poked the face, and then he kind of shook his head like, no, Bob's not really in there, is he? And I just thought, well, there's so much innocence at work here. This child is way less terrified of this body than I am. But I just love for you to react to a little bit of that.
Well, your son's experience and your experience in observing him, I think, is like Humanity 101. And one of the reasons why I've always said that the dead sort of belong in their own funerals is because it is a way that we sort of come to terms. This confrontation between the living and the dead is, I think, very sort of primary in our understanding of our mortality. And mortality not only in the larger sense of the idea of the thing, but mortality in the sense of the thing itself, the dead thing. And I've always said that ours is a species that deals with death, the idea of it, by dealing with our dead, the thing itself. And so I remember when I was a young man, I was talking to a former classmate of mine, a woman. We've been friends for all of our lives. I'd met her in the 3rd grade. I married and had children. She married and had children. She was telling me about her son's first experience with death when I think it was a pet rabbit that died. And I said, well, what did you do when the rabbit died? And she said, well, we got a shoebox and put the rabbit in the box, went out behind the garage and dug a hole and put the rabbit in the box in the hole. And I said, well, that sounds sensible. I said, I wonder why you didn't burn it. And this was back in the late 60s, early 70s, I think, when cremation was just going from sort of the exception to the norm in our country, because like Western people everywhere, we came to cremation kind of late. It was in the 19th century before there was a cremation in the United States. And because of our religious training, we always thought of fire as sort of punitive or wasteful. And yet suddenly nearly half of us were cremating our dead, but we never went to the fire. And the way we would go to a grave. And I felt like saying to my friend, why didn't you, when the rabbit died, fire up the barbecue and have, and put the rabbit on there and or in there. And it's because of we have these complex feelings about the dead, but we act as if tradition will take care of everything. It doesn't. We look into the face of the dead, and we try to imagine the somethingness or the nothingness that they now occupy. And that is, of course, a deeply spiritual and existential question. And I think children have the advantage of being fairly one-dimensional when it comes to confronting the dead, whereas adults bring a bunch of their own, well-curated phobias and concerns, and life experiences. I can remember a boy about the age of your son when his grandfather was laid out, and the boy came in and he looked at the body of his grandfather, and a body in death always looks amazingly unlike themselves because they are, after all, still. Their eyes are not about to be opened. Their mouth is not open or about to be open. The stillness is off-putting in every way. They're dressed in their Sunday best, and they're horizontal. Anyway, this young boy, when he came to see his grandparent, looked and looked, and I said, is everything as it should be? And he said, no, you got his hair wrong. And so I took out my comb from my coat pocket and was about to do something to fix his grandfather's hair. And I said, wait just a second. I went over and got a little step stool. And I said, here, you can fix it. Mm-hmm. And he did. Mm-hmm. And he was not in any way estranged from this body that he'd known for his brief life, And in death did not estrange this body from it. In most cases, adults are estranged by death, and the dead body presents a problem for them. I think we should probably try to get back to our first impulses, which is to say what we, a good funeral in a sense, by getting the dead where they need to go, we get where we need to be. So it's by doing the few things we owe to the dead, a proper disposition, that type of thing, that we get where we have to be emotionally and spiritually and existentially.
Yeah, actually, in one of your pieces, just to go back to the cremation part, I think it's called Tracks, and I think it's sort of about how you imagine your own services. I think you say something like, if you'd be uncomfortable watching the body go into the flames, maybe think it's not a great thing to do. Now they have something called aquamation, where they use water instead. But I want to talk something about something you wrote about the kind of bodiless funerals that seem to be increasingly popular. Not so much because of cremation, and I think during the pandemic, it happened even more because there was this sense that for a while people didn't feel comfortable meeting. So you kind of dealt with things and you said, look, there'll be a memorial service in 12 months or something. But even outside the pandemic, I think there's increasingly a thing that there'll be a memorial service like 3 months from now or something. And I know you think that is also a kind of estrangement, maybe taking the body out of the funerals. It's kind of like taking the most basic part of the funeral out of the funeral.
I do think so. I think the dead at the funeral represent very much what the baby does at a baptism, or the bride does at the wedding, or the groom. And we wouldn't go we don't have memorial nuptials, or we don't have, we want to see these people who are committing to bide with each other and bed with each other and be with each other for the rest of their lives. That's a remarkable and oftentimes unbelievable statement, but that's what they're contracting to do. That's what a wedding is, a bargain made between two people, obviously smitten out of their brain boxes by love, or whatever it is that makes them make such promises. And we all know that some people don't accomplish that. But we also all know people who make marriage look really good and full of grace somehow. And it's the same at funerals. Without a dead body there, we are basically at an event where, I've said before, the talk is uplifting, the music is life-affirming, someone's on hand to proclaim closure, usually just before the Merlot runs out, and everybody's welcome but the dead guy. Something's missing, I think. The dead belong there.
I think, also we all have different sensibilities. I'm actually serious when I say this, though it sounds like a pose or something. When I heard about Tibetan sky burials, which is where the corpse is kind of propped up and birds of carrion eaters come and just pick the bones clean, I thought, that would be great. I would love that. I know it's not really an option for me, but I would love that. Another person would be repulsed by it. We're all probably a little bit different in how we think even about our own bodies after life has left them.
It's true. I think, Tibetan sky burial is very fine, particularly because once the birds have done their job, they are regarded as different in a way, somehow more sacred, more holy because of this favor they have done us, and I suppose that we think of Earth in the same way. Our problem with cremation, by the way, is an ancient and honorable and very efficient way to dispose of our dead properly. It's only that we don't make ourselves available for the metaphor. We don't feel the warmth of the fire. We don't get the illumination because we don't go to the fire. We like the industrial efficiency. We just don't like the fire. And yet we all say, when I'm dead, just cremate me. And the difference is the operative word in that trope is just. And the emphasis is on minimalization. And I think that's where we go off track. If everybody who burned their dead at least got as close to the fire as it took to assist getting the body into it, I think they'd leave that place feeling as if they'd done their job. And by doing their job honorably and properly, I think they would be more quickly able to get back to the business of living without the dead.
Thomas Lynch, I'm horrified to say that I only have maybe a minute or so left, but I wanted to ask you about something we're going to talk about in the final segment of the show today, and that is about people who donate their bodies to medical science. This unfortunately involves a pretty highly publicized case in which some of those bodies, the parts were sold to people who wanted them for various reasons from a morgue at Harvard University. So that obviously seems like just an incredibly profound betrayal and a very shocking and hurtful one. But maybe just talk a little bit about how you even view that question of leaving your body to science. I think you eventually do get back the cremated remains when the medical students are done or whatever. And in a way, it is sort of a message that maybe the dead person can send to the future. I don't know. How do you see it?
Well, I think the impulse to gift ourselves but we all think the gift is going to, cure cancer or allay suffering in some way. Mostly it's for anatomical study to see where the knee bone is connected and the hip bone. It's and that is why most bodies donated for anatomical study become, bodies of parts. And so while I appreciate the impulse to make ourselves useful even after we're dead, and isn't that very American in a way, darkly Calvinist? But anyway, I think we should study what goes on and then decide if this is right for us. And then the living should have veto power, because the living need to take leave of the dead. I've written someplace that the dead don't care. I believe that to be true. And I've spent enough time among and with the dead that and nobody's ever said, do this, do that, give me the blue striped suit or the copper casket. They don't care.
Yes, although my grandmother did leave a note saying that she wanted a certain robe and certain socks. And when we went looking for the robe, there was a piece of paper in a robe, and it just said, "This is it." So anyway, we have to stop here. Thomas Lynch, it is a joy to talk to you. I hope when the novel comes out, you'll honor us with your presence once again. Thomas Lynch, author of 6 collections of poems, 6 books of essays, and a book of stories. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Colin.
Shadows are falling and I'm running out of breath. Keep me in your heart for a while. If I leave you, it doesn't mean I love you any less. Keep me in your heart for a while. When you get up
All right, some quick thank yous. We actually have two technical producers on this show, the Jedi Master Gina Matruda, Bradley O'Connor. Betsy Kaplan, former senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, is the producer of this episode. I have a lot to say about Betsy Kaplan, but we're kind of rushed here. I want to have as much time as possible for our final guest here. Ali Jarmanning is a senior reporter for WBUR in Boston. She's the host and reporter of the podcast Last Seen, Season 4, Postmortem, The Stolen Bodies of Harvard, which gives away a little bit of what we're about to talk about. But Ali, first of all, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
And maybe give us a sense. This these thefts took place over a period of 4 or 5 years. Just give us a quick thumbnail of the story.
Yeah, so this all broke last June, a year ago this June. The former morgue manager at Harvard Medical School, the guy who was in charge of the morgue that for bodies donated to science and then they would come in and out of the morgue, he was accused of stealing and selling body parts to people he met online, inviting people into the morgue. Allegedly, he has pleaded not guilty, and basically selling them to people who were in the oddities field. So these are people that are collecting body parts, basically for display out of almost you would collect antiques or something like that. And so prosecutors said that he did this over a period of about 4 years. Like I said, he's pleaded not guilty. A number of the buyers or the alleged buyers have also been charged. Some people have started to plead guilty, but yeah, it was a pretty long-standing scheme. And when this broke last June, it really kind of threw Harvard and all the family members, hundreds of family members of people who had donated their bodies to Harvard into huge flux.
There's so many things about this that are unsettling and disturbing. In October of 2020, with the pandemic raging, people kind of staying in their houses, this was still going on. And allegedly, this man, Lodge, he almost had shoppers coming in like this was like Trader Joe's or something, except that they were coming into his facility to essentially shop for these body parts. So say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So allegedly, he was allegedly selling to people that he met online, and he and his wife would send body parts through the mail. But also, prosecutors say that in October 2020, so of course Harvard, there was no classes, anything like that happening. He let multiple people come into the morgue, pick out which body parts that they wanted, and then allow them to take them home. And this is one of the things that really, when I spoke to family members about this, family members of the deceased were really sick about thinking about their mother, their elderly mother's body laying there naked, kind of being assessed to decide, do I want this arm? Do I want her face? What part of the skin do I want? Just really made people sick. Kind of that image. I think that this whole thing has really caused so much harm to family members to kind of think about. It was so interesting hearing your last guest talk about it's not the dead, it's the people who are living and continue on. And it's really hard for them to understand how something like this could happen to someone even after they die, which you think is kind of like the last stop in terms of becoming a victim. But this kind of turns that on its head.
I think there's another group of people that's even harder to know about who are hurt by this, and I think that person is symbolized by the couple whose story kind of broke this case open. I think they were in Pennsylvania. I believe the wife went down to the basement where her husband was kind of puttering around in the basement all the time, the way husbands, I guess, kind of do sometimes. Except she found this stuff, right? And you just wonder, what did that do to their relationship? What did that do to her to know that this was going on in the house?
Yeah, I mean, the way that this all unfolded, it was an arrest of a guy in rural Pennsylvania. His name's Jeremy Pauley. And he was pretty an open trader in human remains. That's how he makes his living. He's an antique seller, oddities seller. So his wife definitely knew that this was going on. Police actually came to his house at one point and were like, "Hey, are you selling body parts?" And he's like, "Oh, they're all antiques. They're medical specimens. It's no big deal." Then, of course, his estranged wife allegedly went down into the basement, found organs, kind of more fresh body parts. She ends up calling the police, and then he speaks to the FBI and the police, and that kind of unravels this whole scheme that involves Harvard, that involves a mortuary in Arkansas. I mean, he was allegedly buying, stillborn fetuses, just skin, organs. He was pretty openly working and doing commissions for tanning of human skin to turn into books and things like that. So that was a whole part of this story, too, that when this broke, it wasn't just it was kind of the question of, wait, what are people doing with these body parts? And so when I embarked on my reporting, I really wanted to understand the people who collect this stuff. Why do they do it? How do they do it? Is this legal? And what that world was like.
Yeah, and we'll get to them in just a quick second here. Although I think one of the more poignant pieces of this is the portrait of a woman named Donna, who did decide to donate her body to medical science. When she died, you spent quite a bit of time visiting with and talking to her daughter. They had a wonderful mother-daughter relationship. And that sense of violation. Oh, we should say that Harvard wasn't really able to know whose remains had been sold and whose hadn't. There were kind of two kinds of letters that went out. But I mean, just to get for the daughter to get that letter, I don't know, maybe you could say a little bit about what you heard and all that.
Yeah, so her mother had been dead for 3 years at that point. And, her daughter's name is Amber. She lives in New Hampshire, has 3 little boys. And yeah, her mother died after a long illness, had lived with her. She had kind of moved on from she knew her mom had died of lung cancer. She had understand that. She had kind of grieved her mother's death. And then to get this letter in the mail from Harvard one day that says, our morgue manager has been charged with interstate transport of stolen human remains, and your mother was there at this same time. That was devastating. She told me that she felt like she was going to throw up. Like, this is a nightmare. She just told me some really horrifying things about how she's dealt with this over the last year since she found this out. She's having dreams about her mother's body being found, decapitated places. Whenever she sees this story covered on the news and there's any photos of skulls or anything like that, she looks to try to see if she can see her mother's teeth, because she's like, I would recognize my mother's teeth. And it's just dealing with this horrific unknown. The families described to me as like this interrupted grief. Like, somebody dies, what happened, but now they'll never know what happened to their loved one's bodies. Is her mom's head on a shelf someplace? She's just never going to know.
I think we have time for this. As a radio person, you understand being pressed for seconds here. But, there's there are different types of people who get involved in this. One of the people you spoke to was named Justin Capps. Bradley, let's play C1. This is Justin Capps, a collector of body parts, talking.
I wonder about that. I wonder how many of them even had a choice to become medical specimens. And the only way I was able to get over any of it was to have a sit-down conversation with each one of them that come in here and explain to every one of them, like, I'm not going to disrespect you. I'm going to treat you like you should be treated. As you can see, I do that.
We should say the question was, do you wonder whoever these people were hundreds of years ago, how they would feel about being in someone's living room? This is sort of a slightly different kind of thing, Allie. We're a little bit pressed for time, but explain what he's doing and how it's different.
Yeah, so he and his wife have 7 skeletons, including a fetal skeleton, in their living room, and they consider themselves rescuers of human remains. So these are skeletons that were held by different organizations for kind of rituals and things like that, like the Odd Fellows, those kind of things. And so he has been collecting these like out of storage from places and just putting them back together and displaying them in his living room. And I asked him, how do you think the people who these were would feel about that? And he basically said, I think that maybe they didn't have a choice, but I'm doing the best I can to take care of them now.
We're going to have to stop here, but even though I know this is a somewhat macabre topic, it's really beautifully handled and fascinatingly handled in the podcast. Allie Jarmanning is a senior reporter for WBUR. What we're talking about is a podcast called Last Seen, Season 4, Postmortem, The Stolen Bodies of Harvard. Thank you very much for talking to us today. Thanks to the rest of you for listening. Thanks to Betsy Kaplan for finding yet another topic she could produce that would make me very lightheaded.
From Bangkok to Calgary, and the soles of your shoes are all worn down. The time for sleep is now, but it's nothing to cry about, 'cause we'll hold each other soon in the blackest of rooms. If heaven and hell decide that they both are satisfied, and illuminate the nose on their vacancy signs, if there's no one beside you when your soul embarks, then I'll follow you.